The definition of terrorism has been contentious for many years. In September 2005, 150 world leaders met at the United Nations to define terrorism. But after 2 days, the summit ended without agreeing upon a definition. It is a different case in the academic community, where many scholars of political sciences and professors of international law have a clear definition of terrorism. Robert Pape, an American political science professor at Chicago University, has written 2 books on terrorism, Dying to Win and Bombing to Win.
Terrorism, from my point of view, is probably the ordinary use of the word terrorism, which is the killing of innocents for a political cause. By killing innocents, I mean civilians or off-duty policemen. By a political cause, I mean getting the intention to get those people to change their political behavior. Say, surrender a piece of territory that they're holding on to, or to otherwise change their form of government.
Philippe Sands, a professor of international law at the University College of London and also the author of 2 important books, Lawless World and Torture Team.
I think my general understanding of terrorism is that it is an act which is intended to instill fear in the population of civilians. That's the essential difference between a lawful act and an unlawful act. And lawful act in times of armed conflict basically says you can target military operations. What you can never do is target civilians. And once you start intentionally targeting civilians, you cross a line into illegality, into criminality, and in some cases, depending on the nature of the act, its extent, its purpose, its design, you cross a line from ordinary criminality into terrorism. But drawing those lines is never easy.
So, if targeting non-combatants in order to force a political agenda is the clear definition of terrorism, then why is it that the United Nations Summit failed to define it as such?
Whenever I hear that there's a discrepancy with how the UN or another political body has defined terrorism versus how scholars tend to define terrorism, what I think immediately is that politics have come into the issue. That is, that states are essentially trying to defend what they believe are their own national interests and not wanting to agree to a definition in which someone could claim, oh, you violated the norm. And so what I think is happening is that we shouldn't really be expecting a political body such as the UN to come together to have a clean definition of terrorism.
Gunnar Westberg, a Swedish doctor and co-president of the Nobel Peace Prize winning International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War.
Well, everybody knows what terrorism is, but they know different things. So they couldn't agree. Some of the countries wanted state repression against political groups as terrorists, to be called terrorists. Others did not want that. So because of this disagreement, they couldn't sign any document.
They did not fail to define terrorism, but rather they did not want to, for this would be an indictment on many of them.
Governments have been trying to define terrorism for 50 years, and every time they get to a point where there will be disagreement, because one person's act, which might be characterized in the eyes of some as an act to stop oppression or colonialism or apartheid or discrimination, and which is an act in order to free that particular person, will be seen by another person as a terrorist act. And of course there is also the question of whether or not acts of war and wanton violence, when large numbers of people are killed by attacks in various parts of the world using very sophisticated military means, have consequences which are, in the eyes of some, analogous to terrorist acts. So states, I think, are never going to agree. What states can agree on, if they can't agree on what terrorism is they can agree, and they have agreed, that there are certain things that no one can do in any circumstances. You can never target civilians. That is the golden central rule. Once you cross that line, once you break that rule, you expose yourself to the risk of criminal responsibility.
Throughout the past 2 decades, there has been a growing trend of connecting Muslim people to terrorism. Increasingly, after an act of terrorism, the default reaction around the world has been to suspect Muslim people.
There is a number of erroneous statements that are often made by people in the media in the West. One is to say that not all Muslims are terrorists, we agree, but all terrorists are Muslims. This is a very misleading statement, and factually it is not correct. Muslims, even those who deviate from Islam, who committed acts of terror, were not the first to do it, nor the majority of people who got involved in this kind of operations.
Not just Muslims are terrorists. There are Christian terrorists, there are secular terrorists, there are Jewish terrorists, there are Muslim terrorists, there are Hindu terrorists, and of course there are many, many more of all of those people and all sorts of other people who are not terrorists. It's a very simplistic approach, I suppose, that I'm taking, but it would be quite wrong to ascribe the category of terrorist to any particular group at any point ever. That would be quite wrong.
Terrorism has been there for an enormously long time, and I think it will always be there. And I don't even see that Muslims are the main perpetrators if we look at the world. Hindus are doing an enormous amount of terrorists, for instance. And in Europe, we had all kinds of political groups who strongly influenced the politics of the country through their violent acts.
Terrorism goes back since time immemorial, as defined, as I've defined it, or as even the 1997 Convention defines it. We have examples in Britain. I grew up as a child in London when my mother wouldn't allow me to go shopping in the centre of town because a group known as the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, who happened to be Catholics, were bombing the centre of London. Those were terrorist acts. We know that in the 1940s in Palestine and what is now Israel, Jewish groups used terrorist methods to instill fear in a local population and against the British. Terrorism is not a discriminatory concept. Terrorism doesn't look at a person's ethnicity, identity, or nationality.
Well, it's absurd to think that only Muslim people can be terrorists. Terrorism is not gender, it is not nationality, it is surely not religion. There are Christians who commit terrorist acts, there are Hindus who commit terrorist acts, there are Jews who commit terrorist acts. Terrorism, again, it has, its definition has nothing to do with those kinds of things.
In 1994, Baruch Goldstein killed 29 Muslims and injured more than 150 others while they were prostrating in prayer at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Palestine. Goldstein was a New York-born Jewish Israeli and a member of the Jewish Defense League, a militant Jewish organization founded by Rabbi Meir Kahane. In 1995, Timothy McVeigh, a member of the Oklahoma-based Christian group Elohim City, bombed an office complex in downtown Oklahoma, killing at least 168 Americans and injuring nearly 700. Elohim City established its church in the 1950s and was most frequented by members of the Christian Identity, a group that believed that non-Caucasian people have no souls and can therefore never earn God's favor or be saved. In 2001, a group of Muslims that have come to be known as Al-Qaeda claimed responsibility for hijacking 4 planes and flying them into U.S. civilian and military targets. An estimated 3,000 people were killed, most of them in the World Trade Center in Manhattan, New York.
What's the root cause of terrorism? I have thought long and hard about this, and I think there are many examples one can think of in which one has seen that the root cause of a terrorist act has a political objective which perhaps many people will sympathize with. And it's always a very difficult issue separating out what the underlying rationale and purpose of the act is, and then how the struggle is carried out.
The kind of terrorism that we're seeing today, I believe, is often a response to oppression. People are responding to feeling being oppressed, and one of the things people do when they get oppressed is they feel closed down. At some point, you get this explosion, this boiling over of anger, feelings of injustice, feelings of being not part of the larger group, and they act out. And since they can't defeat it by itself, they oftentimes use terrorist acts.
Terrorism is a form of violence, much like cancer, in that it comes in many, many different forms. And we know we have lung cancers, we have blood cancers, we have skin cancers, and they're not all caused by the same things, and they don't affect the same individuals the same way. So why would we think, if all cancer doesn't have a single cause, why would we think terrorism has a single cause? Well, I don't. And so I studied the most virulent form of terrorism, suicide terrorism. Suicide terrorism kills more people than any other form of terrorism, much like lung cancer kills more people than any other form of cancer. And suicide terrorism also has a specific risk factor associated with it, much like lung cancer. In the case of lung cancer, it's smoking. In the case of suicide terrorism, it's foreign occupation. Foreign occupation, more than religion, more than poverty, more than any other cause, is the leading risk factor in producing suicide terrorism.
While politicians have constantly promoted the notion that the root causes of terrorism are mainly ignorance and poverty, Dr. Robert Pape wrote in his book, Dying to Win, that over 95% of suicide bombings throughout the world had the same strategic objective, and that is to compel foreign armed forces to withdrawing from their country. The book is essential academic research on suicide bombings. Dr. Pape established that the probability of having a suicide bomber amongst any people increases 11 times over if their country falls under foreign occupation.
Very often, if you dig away at the root causes of areas and parts of the world where violent conflict has erupted, where terrorist activity has taken place, and it goes back to time immemorial, one sees at the heart of this very often issues not just of poverty, most likely, in my view, not of ignorance, but of a sense also of injustice at some wrong that has been done and that is continuing over time, that is not being addressed.
In my opinion, it's injustice, humiliation, oppression that are the most common causes of terrorism.
Some people claim that religion motivates terrorists. However, the academic research of Dr. Robert Pape has proved the claim to be false.
What I did is I collected the first complete database of every suicide terrorist attack around the world since 1980. The first version of this database was published a few years ago, and it went from 1980 to 2003. Think of that as like the pre-Iraq database, and then the second version from 2004 on, think of that as the data that's happened since Iraq. And what the data shows quite clearly is that the principal cause of suicide terrorism is foreign occupation. In that period, from 1980 to 2003, there were 315 completed suicide terrorist attacks by 462 suicide terrorists who actually killed themselves. I don't mean attempts. These are people who actually killed themselves. The world leader during that 24-year period was not an Islamic group at all. They're the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. The Tamil Tigers are a Marxist group, a secular group, a Hindu group. In fact, over half of those 462 suicide attackers were purely secular, because you see many Muslim suicide terrorist groups are also purely secular, such as the PKK in Turkey. The PKK in Turkey, which did numerous suicide attacks in the 1990s, is again a Marxist, read anti-religious suicide terrorist group. Because you see, if Islam, as sort of a radical religion, or if it were just radical Muslims doing this, then what you would expect is sort of this thin veneer of suicide attack kind of scattered all around the world. You would expect that, oh, there's 1.4 billion Muslims, you know, there's this teeny tiny fringe of Muslims kind of everywhere who'd be willing to do suicide attack, but that's not the way the data looks. It's really concentrated, and it's really concentrated in occupations.
If the definition of terrorism is targeting innocent civilians to force a political agenda, then a closer look at history reveals the troubling fact that governments have been engaging in terrorism.
One of the reasons that states have never been able to agree in the context of United Nations negotiations on the definition of terrorism is it's never been possible to find a form of words which excludes the possibility that states could in some way participate in terrorist acts. In short, of course states can be engaged in terrorism. If a state places an explosive or uses military force in a random way, harming civilians as part of a political objective, it may well meet the definition of terrorism in that 1997 convention.
Terrorism has been practiced by both governments and militants. In fact, before I did my work on terrorism, I spent 15 years studying air power. I wrote a book called Bombing to Win, which looked at all the uses of air power by states from World War I through the first Gulf War. Over 40 cases, major cases of air power in all. And in many of those cases, air power was used by states to bomb civilians in the hope that bombing those civilians would produce political outcomes. In fact, that's often called terror bombing because it's a form of terrorism.
As the Second World War continued to expand, the deliberate bombing of cities and civilian populations by both the Axis and the Allied powers increased significantly. This was known as strategic bombing and was used as a psychological weapon to break the enemy's will to fight, to decrease its industrial production, and to push the civilian populations to revolt against their regimes. The strategic aerial bombardment in the European theater claimed the lives of over 60,000 British civilians and over 300,000 German civilians. Doubt about the effectiveness of bombing civilians in a conflict comes from the fact that despite the bombing of German cities, the country's industrial production increased throughout the war.
When you bomb civilians, it tends to almost always congeal the support of the civilians against you. That is, the civilians come to hate you. They come to see you as evil incarnate. We may tell ourselves, or the British may tell themselves, they're the good ones here and Hitler's the evil one. But who's killing 300,000 German civilians here? You see what I mean? So the German civilians are very much hating the British, causing them to fight on and make much greater sacrifices than they otherwise would, and in fact to support Hitler in doing some of the nastiest things Hitler was doing at the time. So that what's happening here is that this is backfiring in just about every way imaginable.
On Monday, the 6th of August, 1945, after 6 months of intense firebombing of 67 Japanese cities, an atomic bomb dubbed Little Boy was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, followed 3 days later by the detonation of a second bomb named the Fat Man over Nagasaki. As many as 140,000 Japanese civilians were killed as a result of the initial blast. and within weeks the death toll increased to 250,000 as a result of radiation sickness. Within 5 years, the death toll exceeded 500,000 as resulting cancer and other long-term effects took hold. These are, to date, the only attacks with nuclear weapons in the history of humanity. During World War II, the Nazi regime committed a horrific genocide, killing civilians of non-Aryan ethnicities throughout Europe. Millions of Jews, Polish, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, Gypsies, and trade unionists were prosecuted and killed. In 1948, 50 years after Theodor Herzl established the first Zionist Congress, the State of Israel came to being, imposed on the land of Palestine. From this declaration onwards, using weapons recognized internationally as inhumane and illegal, the Israeli troops carried out systematic persecution, assassination, and mass killing of Palestine, including children. Tens of thousands of innocent Arabs were killed, and more than 5 million became homeless. Most of them became refugees in neighboring countries.
This is called state terrorism. For me, terrorism is when innocent civilians are targeted, no matter who targeted them, whether killed by so-called militants or government military forces. It is a crime and an act of terrorism.
Where's the case? Where's the case where bombing civilians with conventional bombs has actually won a war? We don't have very many. Maybe one, maybe two out of 40, 50 instances. That's not very much. And even those are probably apocryphal, probably not true. When we look at these cases, as I said, 40 cases from World War I to the 1991 Gulf War, many involving air power against civilians, we find no instances of that air power actually causing those civilians to abandon control of territory or to rise up and produce a popular revolt against their own government. In other words, it's not just that bombing civilians is immoral, it's ineffective. And that's a key message, because many people believe that in war we should kind of put morality aside and we should do what works. Well, if bombing civilians doesn't work, then what is the case for bombing civilians?